All right, it's 2:04. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another pollution prevention webinar. Um, Today's webinar is about the impact of global ESG regulations on corporate sustainability. My name is Marley Carmona. I'm going to be the moderator of the session. And as some of you may know, I work at the Center for Sustainable Energy and Environmental Engineering at East Carolina University as an environmental specialist. And I'm excited to guide you through this discussion. Our expert speaker today is Ashlyn Anderson from Stantec. She will be sharing insights on the ESG world regulatory landscape and what's ahead. Please, next slide. So the mission of our center is to conduct scholarly applied research to support sustainable energy development and conserve natural resources. We also aim to enhance public awareness, promote renewable energy technologies through focused research and workforce training. We also have multiple grants that are helping us to provide uh, multiple services to North Carolina manufacturing facilities. I'm going to speak a little bit more about that in the next slide, please. So thanks to those grants, we're able to provide technical assistance to manufacturing facilities across North Carolina, and some of those services include energy, water, and lean assessments, but we also provide regional workshops, pollution prevention trainings, technical engineering support, cash flow, market analysis, and return of investments. Next, please. Um, Before we continue with this discussion, please know that the webinar is actually being recorded right now. It's a feature that is set up by default. So please keep your mics off and your cameras during the session. We're going to have a time at the end to discuss any questions that you may have. You can turn on your mics to address the questions directly to Ashlyn, or you can also put your question in the chat and I will read it for so she can answer. Next slide, please. So Ashlyn Anderson, she's a senior project consultant. She works as at Stantec, as I mentioned previously. She has a career in foreign policy, and she has had experience with accomplished U.S. diplomats who has taught her the spectrum of different factors across public, private, and social sectors involving the negotiation of global issues. She also recognized the influential role of business in achieving global environmental goals, which is how she's able to bring diplomacy skill sets to the sustainable business consulting. At Stantec, Ashlyn is part of the new Environmental, Social, and Governance Advisory Group that supports clients to align with ESG regulations, engage with stakeholders, and develop long-term sustainability strategies. She also specializes in helping companies adopt the recommendations of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is called also TNFD. And also, she helps preparing biodiversity reports under the European Union's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. She works with clients and strives to build authentic relationships and boost internal knowledge and capacity to support cooperation across organizations and lasting changes. She also work in policy at Climate Risk Technology Company. She was a founding member of the sustainability practices at a global business advisory firm in Washington, D.C., funded by former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And also Ashlyn earned an MBA from the Yale School of Management, where she specialized in corporate sustainability and green finance. Please, next. So that great background. I hope everyone finds this session very insightful. and I'm going to turn it over to Ashlyn so she can continue with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Marley, and thank you all for being here. I'm excited to talk to you all today, and hopefully hear from you in the Q&A as well. So as Marley said, I'm a sustainability consultant at Stantec, and Stantec is a large design and engineering firm. We're about 30,000 people, mostly architects, scientists, and engineers. I am none of those, but I'll get into that a little bit more. I am a part of Stantec's Environmental Services Division, and most of my colleagues, I imagine, are doing a lot of the work that you all are doing or you're training to do. So that includes things like energy audits and water audits and supporting permitting processes and environmental remediation projects. So that's kind of the environment that I work in, but the work I do is pretty different. So I'm a part of this new ESG advisory firm at Stantec, and we typically work with the corporate strategy teams of our clients at companies across sectors. So sometimes we'll be working with the corporate sustainability team. Sometimes we'll work with investors who have their own ESG requirements, and sometimes even the CEOs for small companies that don't have a dedicated sustainability department. And a really big part of my job is helping clients interpret the ESG landscape. There's a lot going on. It's, just kind of keeping track of it on a daily basis can be a lot. And much of that landscape is being shaped by new regulations around the world. So we're going to be talking about some of those as we go. But kind of, more broadly, the work that I do is to help these strategy teams interpret this external landscape and then translate the environmental, social, or governance issues into the language of risks and opportunities, because this is what drives strategic, business decision making. So that's what we try to do, is kind of embed this work in the main core of the business. So this is the flow for the presentation I'm going to give today. I'm going to start off at the basics with a discussion on ESG and what it is, because I find that this is an acronym prone to lots of misunderstandings. And I also think it's interesting to hear how others internalize this concept. So we'll start there, and then I'm going to go through some of the major ESG regulations around the world, or touch on some of the highlights, because couldn't possibly go through all of that in this time. And then toward the end, I'll kind of we'll step back and see like what's emerging, what are the newest things that are likely to start shaping this environment in the near future. Okay. So to get us started, I would love it if you could, either come off of mute or enter into the chat, like what comes to mind for you when you hear ESG. And this is, you can free associate. There's lots of associations with this word. So I'll just give you a few seconds to type in some thoughts. Or come off mute. Okay, yep. So the words behind the acronym are coming through. Corporate responsibility, that's great. Okay, anything else? All right, I'll go ahead and give you my thoughts on this. Sustainability, that's good. Yeah, 3 factors to measure sustainability. Great. So I jotted down here some of the things that kind of come to mind for me when I think about ESG and when I try to describe what this movement is all about. And so, yeah, Stephen said corporate responsibility. And so the first thing I wanted to say is ESG is sort of the formalization of corporate social responsibility and also the integration of that into the business. So there in the I don't know, probably within the past 5 years or so, this shift has taken place where there used to be a corporate social responsibility function within businesses, and this function would almost operate entirely separately from the main business. So it would be more like a philanthropic arm of the company. Maybe there would be employee volunteer days and communities where the company operated and stuff like that. And all of that work is still ongoing. ESG takes this further by starting to factor in the environmental and social issues into a company's business model and operations. So it's a very strategic kind of process. And this morning I was on a webinar with the Chief Sustainability Officer at Pepsi, and I really liked the way she described what her work is about. And she said this work is about a fundamental transformation of the entire company to be fit for purpose for the future. And I really like those words, fit for purpose for the future, because this is about the landscape changing, the competitive environment shifting, and being prepared for that environment. And for Pepsi, she touched on a few different kind of prongs of their sustainability strategy. The first is positive or regenerative agriculture. They source 35 ingredients from 60 different countries. And so for them, if you're thinking about, soil changes and things like that, in order to have a resilient supply chain, regenerative agriculture really supports that, strategic business imperative, really. The second area that she talked about was the value chain, and specifically reducing emissions across the value chain, and that's where most of the emissions occur. And there's also some work in their supply chain on packaging goals. And as you all know, there's efficiencies to be found in this work. And then there's, the long-term resilience of having a supply chain that is insulated from some of these risks. And then the last piece she touched on was positive choices for consumers. So thinking about consumer health and the new market segments that you can tap into as consumers move toward healthier options. Because I don't know, Cheetos and Doritos in the Pepsi portfolio. Well, I hope that maybe there's some more nutritious things in the works. But okay, the bottom line is that ESG is about competitive advantage. There's major technological advancements underway in the world right now that are changing the way we do business and the way we work. And the same is true of our natural world and environment. We're facing consequences of a warming climate already. We've lost 70% of species, and there are consequences to these losses, and they show up in how we do business and as we move ahead. Okay, and then setting aside ESG for a moment, it's important to understand that businesses make decisions based on their assessments of risks and opportunities. And so as the ESG architecture has advanced, that is what it's all about. How do we start thinking about these issues in a kind of risk language? And most companies have risk management frameworks that they use to identify, assess, quantify, and manage various broad business risks out there. So ESG management and regulations are, bringing those risks into those frameworks that already exist. And in my work, we talk about two different types of risks broadly. There's physical risks and transition risks. So under physical risks here, I have infrastructure damage due to wildfires, reduced access to water because you're in a water stressed area and that, the trajectory is set to intensify. Again, thinking about Pepsi, soil changes and how that affects crop yields. You also have heat-related illnesses, and I think OSHA is in the process of coming up with some new guidelines to protect workers against heat that's intensified by climate change. And then there's, again, getting back to that supply chain resilience topic and adding natural disasters to that. And then on the right side is transition risks. And these are the risks that come about based on how quickly, how orderly the world moves into one that is maybe more low carbon, uses less resources, or kind of starts to decouple resource use from growth. And it is a messy process. And so when you think about transition risks, there's a number of categories. There's legal risks. We're seeing more lawsuits against companies for their contributions to climate change. And that takes away, time and resources from companies when those come about, and potentially, broader implications from there. Transition risk can also take the form of, carbon taxes or carbon border taxes, like the one that Europe is implementing. And there can be, just regulatory, broader regulatory compliance requirements and penalties for non-compliance. There's also stranded assets. If you think about, the way the world is moving away from coal, because it's yes, it's a, more polluting energy source, but, it's also not, there's other cost competitive sources at this point. So you're starting to think about these stranded assets that may not have value as, the market shifts. So those are some examples of how ESG risks are broken down. And then I also just wanted to kind of touch on the broad range of topics that fall under ESG. So as an ESG professional, you have to be able to have a pretty broad view of a variety of topics. And so just to give you a little bit of flavor there. So there's me on the team, and I have a background in policy and focus a lot lately on corporate nature strategies. But my colleague is a human rights lawyer, and they specialize in assessing supply chains for, forced labor or other human rights issues. And then I have public health professionals who focus on worker and community health. And so, while we have kind of our areas where we specialize a little bit, we have to be pretty nimble and well-versed in a number of topics that a lot of these regulations cover. And this is also why it's incredibly important for ESG and sustainability professionals to have strong working relationships in their organizations, and have relationships with people who have the very deep expertise and know how to implement the kinds of design and engineering interventions that we need to achieve sustainability goals. And, I'll say one thing I really love about doing this work at Stantec is I am embedded in a huge company of engineers and scientists who I can, call up and say, can you help me understand how this works? Or can you come join this call with the sustainability team at this company and help them understand what this is going to take. So, yeah, and that's becoming, I think, as this movement progresses too, and we're moving more into the implementation of things, this kind of collaboration and these connections need to be stronger. And it's making its way. Okay, and then one more thing before I jump into talking through some of the regulations, wanted to give you a bigger picture of what's driving this movement. So of course, governments and regulations are a huge driver, but you also have investors. We have a client who is a global bank that we help this bank evaluate clients in their portfolio, and they decide whether they're going to, lend more money or to that company based on their ESG performance. So investors are starting to care about this. They have their own financing, ESG financing goals. You also have activist investors that are pushing for changes in companies that they have a stake in. NGOs, I think one of the very cool things happening right now is we have more geospatial data than ever, and satellites that are specializing in monitoring in real time, like methane emissions or land cover. And so as an NGO or academic, whatever that is, we can independently assess what's going on much more than we were previously. So that's another driver there. And then, of course, customers who want more sustainable options or want to buy from more sustainable companies. And then employees who want to work for companies that take this stuff seriously. So there's a lot at work behind this movement. Okay, and with that, let's talk about some of the big regulations, because these no doubt are playing a huge role in initiating changes in organizational behavior and decision making. And I'm not gonna spend too much time on this slide because this is like really like an acronym festival happening here, but I wanted you to just see how this kind of movement has grown. These are a variety of voluntary reporting frameworks and standards that have been developed for companies that have wanted to be disclosing environmental and social information for a while now. So if you think, you can Google sustainability reports of most companies, and a lot of them will reference, GRI, SASB, as how they have gone about reporting this information. And the goal of these frameworks has been to bring more consistency to how this information is reported, because it's quite a bit to sift through, and these are complex topics. The way that these have started to enter into regular. Oh yeah, did you have a question?
না, ফোন করেছিলাম যে ওই যে আমি কিন্তু কালকে কথা বলছি কেমন এর সাথে, ওই যে মানে স্কটের সাথে কথা হয়েছে আমার, কেমন?
Okay, well, anyways, a lot of these frameworks and standards have made their way into regulations because governments have said, okay, there's a precedent. This is the way it's been done before. Let's just make this mandatory. And they write a regulation referencing some of these standards. So now getting into some of these mandatory regulations, the only place to start is Europe, because they have by far the most comprehensive and ambitious ESG regulations. And they don't just apply to European companies. So any company that has a certain number of employees or operations in Europe has to report under these regulations. So that's most large US companies. And I'll start in the middle here with CSRD. This is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And I think about this as sort of the linchpin of Europe ESG regulations. And in this first row here, the kind of bolded, underlined words, I wanted to kind of describe, like, what is the purpose of each of these regulations, because they do different things. CSRD is about bringing consistency and transparency to how companies are assessing and managing environmental and social issues. And it covers all the topics listed below across the E, S, and G categories. And it requires companies to not just consider these issues in their direct operations, but also in their, sometimes vast global supply chains. So you can imagine at this point in time, it's pretty rare for a company to have this kind of visibility into their supply chains. Most companies don't know where the cotton is grown in the textiles that it uses to make its apparel. So that's a big, I think, thing that you'll see over the next few years is companies getting more sophisticated into how they trace their supply chain and the materials in that. But to close out on CSRD, this is about giving stakeholders, whether it's governments, investors, NGOs, whoever, better and more systematized information about ESG risks and programs. And then if we move over to the left to the EU taxonomy, this is a classification system. So it's meant to bring clarity to how the world defines a sustainable business activity. And it sets out criteria for each business activity. So for example, if you're a company that manufactures car parts and you want to say that your car manufacturing activities are sustainable, then according to the EU taxonomy criteria, those cars need to have zero tailpipe carbon emissions. And then there's a number of other criteria they specify. But it kind of makes it a little bit more black and white. It's obviously still complicated, but it's meant to stop the greenwashing that has gone on within companies and say, like, no, you can't call something sustainable unless it meets these marks. And ultimately, what a company reports under the EU taxonomy regulation is how much of their capital expenditures, operating expenditures, and sales are aligned with sustainable business activities. And I think this is actually a very cool regulation. As boring as some of this can be, it's cool because it's a way to compare companies, in the same industries. Like if you're like a government that's procuring vehicles, I'm using the government as a customer in this case, but you can say, oh, well, our government is trying to be more sustainable. We have these goals, so we want to source from a company that makes sustainable vehicles. And then they can see, well, this company, 60% of their sales were for sustainable cars last year versus this one that was at 45%. So it helps start to kind of benchmark progress and be able to tell which companies are actually investing in this. How is that paying off? So that's the EU taxonomy. And then lastly, the last one I'll throw at you is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which people call the CSDDD. And this regulation sets out environmental and social due diligence requirements. So the way this works is, and how to kind of differentiate it from CSRD, is that if you're a company that is in a very emissions intensive industry, like you make steel or something, under the CSRD, you need to report, like, yes, we are a significant contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. These are our emissions. It's providing that transparency. The CSDDD is then going to say, okay, great. Well, what are you going to do about it? Because now that you've said that you're in an emissions intensive industry, we want to see a climate transition plan that shows when and how you're going to reduce those emissions. So CSDDD is more prescriptive about what needs to be done. CSRD is more about what are you doing? Just tell us. And this is, another way to kind of depict how they relate to each other. I think Marley's going to share these slides. So, you can kind of come back to these. There's plenty to sift through. These are like hundreds and hundreds of page long regulations. So very fun to dive into if anyone is interested. And then here, I also wanted to show you the topics that are covered under the CSRD. So you have, climate change, pollution, water, biodiversity, circular economy. And then on the right, workforce, workers in the value chain, communities, customers, business conduct. And then there's subtopics that are linked to each of these. And a company likely does not need to report on all of these topics and subtopics. There is a process that the regulation requires a company to undertake to determine which of these topics are material or relevant to the business. And that process also has to be documented and disclosed so that, you know, regulators can say, all right, this is how they determine that biodiversity does or does not matter to their business at this point in time. Any questions there on the Europe stuff before I go on? Because I know it's a little bit dense. Okay, I'll keep going.
I have a question. Sorry, I have a question here.
Yeah, go for it.
Do you think that you said EU companies that they are disclosing? Is there any USA company they will dare to declare this kind of things?
Yes. So most you know, like Fortune 500 large US companies have to comply under the European regulations. They have different kind of thresholds, but it's based on either the number of employees that you have in Europe or the number, the sales, the dollar sales that that you do in Europe. That would kind of bring you in scope of that regulation, regardless of whether you're headquartered in Europe or not.
That means they can only declare their European part of the business, what they are doing on the sustainability part, right?
Are you asking about the European side of a US company or
European side of US companies' business? They will disclose related to that what they are doing, but in USA what they are doing, maybe they might not declare also. That is not a binding, right?
yeah, I don't think so. So I guess I would say, if I understand your question correctly, is that the European regulations are kind of setting the bar for companies globally. It's a high bar for sure, and I don't think many companies are performing at that bar at this point in time. But that is kind of, I guess, the goalpost for companies right now globally, because again, like there's so many ways for you to get caught up into these regulations that, you know, even if you're not subject to CSRD, you might be a supplier for a company that's subject to CSRD. And so they're going to come to you eventually. So it's, it's very sweeping, I would say.
But based on my study of the European companies, because I do research in sustainability, there are several companies in Europe, they are trying to achieve as at least nearer to the expectation of this. Yes, the 3D that you said, that model. But in USA, there are very few companies. They normally even try to do that. So that's the problem here.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not not happening in an even way, for sure. Yeah, and I'll turn now to this slide here because to talk a little bit about the US environment, because there aren't as nearly as many regulations as in Europe when it comes to ESG. So the big news in the US when it comes to ESG regulations over the past couple of years was a rule that the Securities and Exchange Commission finalized last year. This was a rule that would require all publicly listed US companies to disclose their greenhouse gas emissions and climate risks. And this was a very contentious process. When they first put out the proposal for this rule, they got a record number of public comments. So everyone interested in where this rule was going to go. And as soon as it was finalized, there were lawsuits. And so the SEC put the rule on hold. And because of the results of the US election, the rule is not likely to survive, which
Anyone
is,
yes,
yeah,
it should not survive.
yeah,
Cannot.
it's right. However, there are rules that have passed in California, and they passed in the California legislature, and they're set to go into effect in 2026. And they are very similar to the SEC rule, and actually a little bit more ambitious because they want to see greenhouse gas reporting for all three scopes, whereas the SEC had watered it down quite a bit. And similarly for this California rule, you don't have to be headquartered in California to have to comply with this regulation. If you do business in California, that's going to bring you into scope. So this is going to affect a lot of the companies that would have been affected by the SEC rule. I mean, the loss of the SEC rule is definitely unfortunate. I saw somewhere that publicly listed companies in the US emit 11 gigatons of greenhouse gases. That's the estimate for 2024, which is about 20% of the world's footprint. So it would have been, effective to make these companies start to measure and disclose this information. However, I don't think it is a major setback again, because they're probably having to do this for some other jurisdiction in the world right now. And not just that, like, yes, there's other regulations, but also this has started to become material, because if you're thinking about if there are carbon taxes in any of the jurisdictions where you work, then you want to reduce your emissions to lower that cost. Or if you have, operations in areas that are vulnerable to the effects of climate change, you need to start making some investments to make those assets resilient so that you're not paying a lot more down the line over damage. So that's kind of my thoughts on what's happening in the US. And we'll see what happens with the California rule, because the legislation has passed and it's going into effect very soon, but they actually haven't written the official rules yet. So a lot of companies will be watching that in the months ahead. Okay, and I'm just going to close with, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly so we have time for Q&A, but wanted to just touch on kind of things on the horizon here. And the first is, obviously we just had an election here, and I wanted to present kind of two different vantage points through which to view these results and their implications for ESG and climate action. So this is a chart that Bloomberg put out that, summarized the scenarios. We're all the way over in the right column there. And, Bloomberg said, it's going to be a very negative impact for clean power and clean transportation. Can think about things like electric vehicles. There's also the future of the climate infrastructure bill. The IRA is also uncertain, and that's what provided tax credits for wind and solar and other clean energy technologies. And I agree. I think the changes ahead are probably in the short term going to affect the companies that are at the center of this clean transition. But I also wanted to kind of balance that with this view here, which really is kind of zooming out and recognizing that there's a lot of macro trends at play that are driving these things. So this is some data that was put out by Arjun Murthy, who's an energy analyst, and I really appreciate his blogs because they just give kind of a fresh data-driven perspective. But what I want you to take away is, again, that there are lots of drivers influencing ESG issues like decarbonization. And there, like any one government, there's only a certain amount that they can do to kind of turn back this tide. So on the left, you can see this downward trajectory in emissions in the US since 2003. And then also interesting on the right shows US oil output from Clinton through Biden. And you can see output was actually higher under Biden than in Trump's first term. So I think this is interesting food for thought and just kind of grounding this work and this movement in the grand scheme of things. And then briefly to touch on this, I did want to mention some Supreme Court rulings recently that are going to definitely have an effect on federal regulation in the United States. So some of you may have heard of the Loper-Bright case that overturned the Chevron doctrine. And the Chevron doctrine essentially it meant that in court, the judiciary system would defer to federal agencies and subject matter experts to interpret any kind of ambiguities that would appear in a statute, like the Clean Air Act or something. So if there's something unspecified or ambiguous, the judiciary would defer to the EPA to interpret that part of the legislation. The overturning of this doctrine expands the power of the courts to review and strike down regulatory efforts. So basically, the judiciary would be interpreting some of these things rather than federal agencies that implement this stuff. So another thing to watch and that will have an effect. But I'll go ahead and close here and kind of come back to these major trends driving this movement. In the past couple weeks, I've heard the terms like green stalling and green hushing to describe the effect that we might see on this movement in the near term. And yes, I think you could see companies not being as out front or vocal about ESG or sustainability work. But the reality is that sustainability work is already being embedded in future business plans, and the seeds are kind of already being planted for future competitive dynamics. So in my view, at least, I think this movement is here to stay and evolve. It's evolved. This is a new area and it's evolved very quickly. So, and just like one note on that too, like we've seen a lot of new positions of ESG controller at companies, and that is, essentially in response to these regulatory requirements and needing to like really start organizing data within companies on what they're already doing to manage these issues and, identify what else is needed. So yeah, thank you all for being here. I hope that this was interesting as much as regulations can be, and I welcome your questions.
Does anybody have a question for Ashlyn? You can turn on your mic or drop the question in the chat and I can read it.
No, I already asked question. I think in the same line, I see that the EPA administrator also is going to change EPA. EPA have some rules, regulations, those most of them will change. So I'm afraid whether in USA we will be able to progress. And there is no carbon tax in USA until now. Only California limited carbon tax they wanted to impose, but it is not like the Australia or EU. So maybe we are what the current status, we are going to maintain that status quo. That can be the only hope from me. Do you agree with me?
Yeah, no, I hear you. I think I'm trying to stay optimistic. I think that, I don't think I just go back to, I don't think there's going to be any major setback for any company that's competing in the global market. Because I do think it's starting to become clear what the financial implications are of ignoring this stuff. And it, obviously this really varies depending on the sector that you're in. I know we've seen a lot of like oil and gas companies that have backpedaled on their decarbonization commitments and things like that. And no doubt, like we're way behind the global warming goals set out in the Paris Agreement. And I, there are plans, for when we overshoot 1.5. But I still think, in addition to continuing to focus on, shifting business and decarbonizing all of that, we also do have to prepare for, some of the consequences that we've sort of locked in at this point. And then, okay, a couple questions in the chat about training. Yeah, so there's several training programs I'm aware of that are like, I think getting kind of like the broad view of sustainability. There's like the Climate Base Fellowship. I think it's like a 6-week program that you can go through, and you kind of do like a quick overview of whatever greenhouse gas accounting, setting a science-based target, doing a life cycle analysis, stuff like that. And there's also 1.5 consulting. They have the 1. OPF Academy, and it's a similar 6-week kind of program that's meant to, I think that one is particularly geared toward people that want to move into consulting, but equally good if you're working in-house at a company, to just kind of get that broad view. And yeah, and then the second question is kind of similar, training requirements for professionals in the ESG field. So I think that, if you're like ever on LinkedIn and you are looking for jobs in like the climate or ESG space, a lot of the job descriptions right now are written like a wish list. They want somebody that has, the broad understanding of the landscape, that understands the regulations, and that also has like technical expertise in a particular area. And I think it's, I know at least based on, what kind of like reports have said, is that we don't have people that have 10 years of experience in ESG and something else. And so I do think that a shift is starting to happen. And one of those is a better link within organizations between like environmental health and safety teams who are on the ground and who are doing kind of the day-to-day management, and the ESG sustainability teams who are thinking about the broader strategy. And I see that happening even within like my company at Stantec, and how we're going about approaching projects. Because you really do need that mix of like, hard skills and like, broad landscape analysis and stakeholder management. Because it's great if we have an engineering solution, but the like almost harder part here is getting organizations and the people within them to think differently about their job roles, and and being incentivized to do things differently. So it becomes a change management issue as well. And so, I think the long answer to your question is like, I believe that eventually the ESG field won't be a distinct field. But the institutionalization of ESG will require the combination of skill sets, the people that can help usher it across an organization through relationships and communications and things like that, and the people that know how to implement it. And those people need to be talking to each other. So different, I think, points where you can come at this work from.
Is there any other question? Otherwise, we can prepare to wrap up. We'll see questions in the chat. Okay, I don't see questions, so thanks so much, Ashlyn, for this insightful presentation today. I know we're a little short on time. I want to respect everybody's activities for this afternoon, but please know that we're going to send the slides, as Ashlyn mentioned earlier. We're also going to share some information for our next events. We have another webinar scheduled for December 3rd, and it's going to be about ISO 14001. And if you're interested about that topic, I will invite you to join and to register. Again, it's free, and expect some reminders just about it. Otherwise, well, thanks so much, and looking forward to the next session. Thanks, Ashlyn.
Thank you. And I put my email in the chat if anybody would like to get in touch or talk further.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
All right. Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.